Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
And then I'd like people to ask themselves, why is it so easy to write women out of history? Why, she's been dead since 2009. Why has it taken so long for us to recognize the contributions of this extraordinary, difficult, but extraordinary woman?
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John McNamara, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 37, the one with the numbers that add up to 10. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Eileen McNamara about her book, Eunice, the Kennedy That Changed the World. Eileen McNamara is the author of Eunice, the Kennedy Who Changed the World, which was released in April 2018. She spent most of her career as a journalist at the Boston Globe, where she won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary and contributed to the newspaper's award-winning coverage of the clergy sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, chronicled in the Oscar-winning movie Spotlight. As a reporter and columnist, she covered everything from the night police beat to the U.S. Congress, focusing attention on such pressing social issues as battered women, infant mortality, and juvenile crime. She is now director of the journalism program at Brandeis University, where she was the recipient of the Louis Dembitz Brandeis Prize for Excellence in Teaching. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I am your host, John McNamara. Hope you're having a good day. I am here with Eileen McNamara, author of Eunice, the Kennedy Who Changed the World. Hey, Eileen, how you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, John.
Oh, thanks so much for coming on. I'm so excited to talk with you because this is an epic book, I think monumental in scope, and I really found it fascinating. So I'm really excited to both get a little bit of insight into how you put the book together and sort of everything about Eunice Kennedy and her story, which is just absolutely wonderful. I mean, she did so much good stuff. So I always like to start off just with kind of a summary of the book. And I know that in this case, it's a biography of Eunice Kennedy, but maybe just talk a little bit about her and the biography and the book itself.
Well, I think when you write a full-scale biography, you're really trying to take somebody from cradle to grave. And I guess I would say first about Eunice that she was in many ways a classic middle child. She was the fifth of 9, so she was the exact pivot in the middle of that family. And I think, as lots of middle children know, you can get lost in the middle of a family. And I think her whole life was about being seen in a family where that was very difficult for the sisters. The young men were seen, but the girls were not. And that was compounded for her by being the middle child.
So let's talk a little bit about your creative process, because this is a huge book, and you put we were talking just before, and you put 7 years of your life into this. Mm-hmm. So I am fascinated in that part. So first off, how did you even find out about Eunice Kennedy? How did you get interested in her story?
Well, I was a reporter for 30 years at the Boston Globe. It's sort of hard not to know the stories of most of the Kennedys in varying degrees of detail, of course. I didn't know much about her. I knew probably what most Americans knew about her, which is her connection to the Special Olympics. More than that, I can't say that I really knew a great deal. But there was the coincident timing of her death. She died 2 weeks before her brother, Senator Edward M. Kennedy. And I knew Senator Kennedy because I had covered Congress during the Reagan administration for the Globe. And he had often talked about her as a formidable character in his life. She was 11 years older than Ted, so when she spoke, he listened. So that I knew something about her from him just casually. And then I could not help but notice the various ways their deaths were treated in the public prints, in the newspapers. And when Ted died 2 weeks after Eunice, the New York Times ran a number of photographs of the family from their time growing up right through their adulthood. And in almost every single photograph, the sisters were misidentified or omitted. So it just hit me. Invisible or interchangeable. That was kind of their lot. And I knew that there was nothing about Eunice that was invisible. She was not like her other sisters.
So what was it like putting the book together? I mean, you knew the Kennedys are such a big family. There's so much about them. How did you start? How did you decide, okay, I'm going to write this book. What should I do? How should I do my research? How should I put everything together? What's it going to look like?
Well, the Shrivers had 5 children. So I knew I couldn't do the book unless I got their cooperation. And, trying to get 5 people to cooperate with you is not an easy challenge. I mean, that took a couple of years. First of all, the Kennedy families had lots of experiences with journalists that haven't turned out so well. So how do you convince a group of siblings that you're sincere, that you aren't interested in writing a hagiography of their mother, but you're not going to write a hatchet job either? You want to write a fair, comprehensive story. Well, that took a little doing. They had to get to know me. They didn't know me at all. They had to look at my work over time to decide whether they thought they would trust me. And then I knew that they had 33 boxes of her private papers that no one, including them, had ever seen. No one had gone through them. And Tim Shriver used to joke to me, I don't know why you're so obsessed with getting access to those boxes. There's probably nothing in them except VHS tapes of Maria on the Today Show. And of course, there were no VHS tapes in those boxes. There was just a treasure trove of documentation from her life. So I guess most of the process was trying to convince them to cooperate so that I could get that access, so I could learn about her, so I could know her.
Yeah. And once you started that process, once you got to know her a bit more, how did you start to filter out what would be worth drilling down and talking about in the book versus what is interesting but maybe not important enough to rise to the level of being in the book?
I don't think I really knew that until I was in the process of writing it. You become overwhelmed. I mean, I had boxes and boxes of research. In addition to those 33 boxes of her private papers, I spent a lot of time in the archives in a lot of places, including London, where she went to high school, the Kennedy Library, of course, here in Boston, Stanford, where she went to university in California, trying to assemble the pieces of her life. And you don't really know what's important until kind of the end of your reporting process. The research is really about keeping an open mind about what you're learning.
Mm-hmm. What else? So you look through these boxes, which sounds like a huge task in and of itself. What other work did you do? I mean, I remember the end of the book has something like 50 pages of notes and bibliography and all this other stuff. So in terms of interviews and speaking with other people, how did you go about deciding what research would make sense to do versus, where this is enough information?
So for the first couple of years that I was doing the research, before I knew definitively that there would be a book, because I told Simon & Schuster, I won't write it unless I get access to her private papers. I'll do the research now, but I won't commit to writing this book until I have access to things that will let me really know her. So then you read all the secondary sources. You read everything that's been written, and then you put it away, and you don't look at it again, because lots of it isn't very good or isn't very reliable. The stuff that looks good and looks reliable, I want to go back and find the primary sources where they got those, which is what took me to the archives in so many places. I guess that's how you start, and then once you've got everybody's cooperation, and they've handed over this material to you, the biographer Robert Caro, the great biographer of Lyndon Johnson, says a biographer's job is to turn every page. And I never really understood what he meant until I was lost in this morass of paper. Because they hadn't been cataloged, her papers included newspaper clippings next to letters from Lyndon Johnson, next to who knows what. And in turning over some of those pages, I encountered surprising things.
Yeah. Well, and they made it into the book.
Yeah.
One of the things you said in the book struck me, and you wrote in, I think it was in the introduction, that there have been hundreds of books written about the Kennedys, but none focused on Eunice before. So you mentioned that maybe some of the sisters, or the sisters maybe generally, didn't get as much noticed. But why was that, and maybe why was Eunice specifically overlooked?
Well, I think they were all overlooked because they were women. I mean, I think it was as simple as that. Eunice writes a very plaintive letter to her father when she's a young woman in the 50s. And she says, "Dear Daddy, you're spending so much time on everyone's career. What about me?" And she knew the answer to that question. The answer was, you're a girl. And in the Kennedy household, it was the men that mattered. And the women supported the men. But Eunice was never cut from that cloth. She wanted an independent career of her own from the very beginning.
Yeah. So, okay, let's go way back. Let's go to the beginning. And you know, her incredible story really does start with her childhood, where she faced just seemingly lots of hardships. I mean, it started with her childhood, where she was kind of going in and out of hospitals. She had a lot of health issues throughout her life. Like you said, she was the middle child in a large family. Her parents were often away. You know, how did those childhood, teenage years really form her as an adult?
I think she made a conscious choice at a pretty young age that she was going to get her parents' attention. However she did it, she would get their attention. And the way she decided to do it was to propel herself against all the odds, against the physical ailments she did have. Someone else might have taken to her bed. Eunice, took to a sailboat and took to the tennis court. She was the best athlete in that family. All those famous touch football games we remember from Hyannisport, she's the quarterback. She was formidable. She pushed through. She wasn't like Jack in this regard. She and Jack were quite similar because they were both sickly as children. Jack did take to his bed, and he read. He read voraciously. She had too much emotional energy. She was a nervous child. She had to be physically active. So that's how she pushed her way through it.
And do you feel that that's something she was able to hold on to and then used throughout her life?
I think she did. I think she had remarkable energy against all odds. When I think of the physical ailment she did have, I sort of find it astounding that she did all the things she did. She was just like this overwound clock that you couldn't stop her.
Yeah. And thinking about the rest of the family. So one of the things you start with, and is kind of a theme throughout the book, is Rosemary, is the oldest sister, and what her life is like versus the rest of the family, and how that shaped Eunice. Rosemary had many disabilities, and it wasn't really clear what exactly was happening, and it seemed like the family was, or maybe even still is, a little bit concerned with getting that information, both for Rosemary and for Eunice. It seemed there were some times throughout the book where it was sort of unclear as to what was actually going on. And, Eunice was kind of given the responsibility of watching over Rosemary and taking care of Rosemary, and like you said, when she was sailing, sometimes that would involve yelling at Rosemary to get her to hurry up and sail. How did those experiences with Rosemary kind of shape Eunice's mind and then help her think about what she wanted to do with her future?
Well, I think everybody's a mix of contradictions, aren't we? I mean, most people. And I think Eunice is too. She was paired with Rosemary by her mother, and her responsibility was to take Rosemary on as crew when she was in sailing races. And she did that. I don't know how cheerfully she did that, but she did do it. And that didn't mean that she didn't want to win that race. So even though she knew that her sister had intellectual disabilities, they were pretty mild, by the way, when she was a child. So they wouldn't have prohibited her from being a crew member on a sailboat. But she pushed her. She pushed her really, really hard because Eunice wanted to win. She wanted to beat Jack. And I think the real issue with Rosemary happens later, when she's a young woman, when she's 23, and her father has her lobotomized. And she's left unable to walk and unable to talk. And the sister that she knew and helped nurture and loved essentially disappeared from the family.
Yeah, and Eunice was a real champion for the disabled or those maybe that didn't have people to speak up for them. And, is Rosemary sort of 100% the reason? Do you think that might have happened otherwise? Or is there something somewhere in between?
Well, I think she would have been as ambitious as she was and as determined to accomplish what she did. It might have been in a different area had it not been for Rosemary. But I think she was not fueled by compassion. There is so many myths about Mrs. Shriver. And one of them was that she did all this because, her heart bled for these children. And I think she did care deeply for their pain and for the way that they were disenfranchised from society. But mostly it was rage. She was furious at the way Rosemary's life turned out. She blamed the doctors who had no answers for her parents. She blamed her parents who had no answers for Rosemary. She blamed the whole culture of expertise. So she set out on her own to set those experts aside and to find answers that she could live with. And I think she did.
Yeah, that's interesting the way you phrased that, because, the next thing I wanted to ask about was actually her connection with religion, which, often people turn to when they're having trouble finding answers through a more traditional route. And it seems early on when Eunice attended the Society of the Sacred Heart, she really relished the experience and seemed to have a strong religiosity that other students didn't have. And I think you wrote, when she met the new pope, she was almost hysterical, and she was just so excited, and you wrote this letter. And, why do you think that she was so drawn to religion? Was it connected to any of that stuff? And how did that religiosity then play into, her political views and what she ended up doing later in life?
Well, I think she got her piety from her mother. I mean, Rose was a devout Catholic, but they could not have been more dissimilar as Catholics. Rose's piety was a very passive piety. She went to Mass every day, as did Eunice. But Eunice wanted her Catholicism to be at work in the world. She believed in social justice, and she believed in making a contribution. And the values that she brought to that endeavor came from her deep Catholic faith. There's no question of that. But that's about as far as the comparison with Rose goes, because you don't see that activism on the part of her mother.
And it's interesting you mentioned that she was so concerned about social justice. I mean, one of the things that kind of jumped out at me when you talk about her life after she transferred to Stanford University was that it seemed like she was living this life that was based upon, wealth and connections and prestige. She got a former president, right, to help her transfer to Stanford more easily. and her friends were other kind of wealthy white people. How did she sort of grapple with that privilege throughout her life? Do you feel like she was able to recognize and understand and use that, or was there something going, like a cognitive dissonance going on there?
I don't think there is any dissonance. I mean, of course, her friends were rich and white because her family was rich and white. She grew up in the Hyannisport Country Club and in Florida country clubs. They wintered in Palm Beach. When Joe Kennedy was the ambassador to the Court of St. James's in London, they spent their summers on the Riviera. She lived a very spoiled, entitled life. But she could have had that define her life for her entire life, and she didn't. At Manhattanville, where she first enrolled in college in New York City, she was a volunteer in settlement houses. It was the first time she'd encountered real poverty and real neglect and saw what the government was not doing for people. She did the same at Stanford. Her first job in the Justice Department is about prisoners of war. Her second job in the Justice Department is about juvenile delinquents. She visits detention centers in the 1940s in Washington, in which the furniture is all broken, that there's no toys for the children to play with, there's no classrooms, there's no doctor or nurse on staff. The place is overcrowded. She's horrified and indignant. And it's interesting because during that period of her life, she lived with her brother Jack, who was a freshman congressman from Massachusetts. And Jack didn't display any of the indignation about social justice issues that his sister did. But the headlines in Washington and the Washington Herald and other papers were full of Eunice Kennedy denouncing these conditions for young juvenile offenders.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's something I think I noticed across her life and throughout many of the situations that she ended up in, where she was the voice really pushing for things to happen and, whispering in the ears of various presidents over the decades to try and, get this change to happen and to pay attention to people that had been marginalized. And
if you look at her life, you see how often Eunice got there first, ahead of her brothers. I mean, she's talking about juvenile delinquency in 1947. Bobby Kennedy doesn't know it exists until 1962. Where did that come from? Well, it came from the kind of work that she chose to do. She did social work in New York, in Chicago. She went to a women's prison in Alderson, West Virginia, the only federal prison at the time for women. And she came out of there thinking, why are we locking up women for nonviolent crimes? Women who often were lured into crime by their partners, men. So she came out with a strong sense about prison reform in 1950, which Ted Kennedy didn't take up until 1975.
Yeah, she was a real trailblazer.
She was.
And that takes a lot of courage. And I guess what I'm kind of trying to get at with some of these questions is thinking about, where did that courage come from? How did she build that reservoir up? How is that something that we can work to cultivate as well? What can we learn from how she was able to create herself?
Well, I think she gives a very interesting speech toward the end of her life, maybe 2 years before her death. There was an event for her at the Kennedy Library in Boston to celebrate her accomplishments. And she was a little snide as she took the podium to say how lovely it was that finally, after all of these events at the library for the men, someone was acknowledging one of the women. And in the course of that speech, she said, I was told my whole life that real power was not for me. But she didn't listen. The point of her life is that when she was told that real power was not for her, she ignored that. Joe Kennedy wouldn't give her power, so she took it. She basically hijacked the family's charitable foundation, and she turned it to the cause that defined her life, helping children with intellectual disabilities. She didn't wait for somebody to say, Eunice, why don't you do this? she simply did it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because that's the kind of behavior that there's, I think, a bit of a double standard about, in our society in terms of when men and women do things like that. And there's a couple instances of stories in the book sprinkled throughout where it's sort of like, Eunice came off as a little brusque or, seemingly something like that. So I think it's interesting even today, that's still something that people might have trouble doing because of the way that it's looked at by others.
Her father once said of her, if Eunice had had balls, she would have made a hell of a politician. Well, Eunice was a hell of a politician, and she didn't have balls. Whether she would have ever been elected to public office, I'm skeptical. I think she would have been a terrific senator, maybe even a great president. She certainly had the passion and the drive and the work ethic. But she was a difficult person. She was imperious. She was impatient. She was actually the definition of impolitic. She didn't suffer fools. But neither did her brother Bobby, and it didn't stop him from winning a Senate seat from New York or running for the presidency.
Yeah. So, all right, we got a little bit ahead of ourselves there, but let's cut back to the middle here. And so she was doing a lot of great work when she started to work with the juvenile delinquency stuff. This story I thought was so interesting. She went to do research on women in prison by living in a prison.
Right.
Talk about what that was like.
Well, she lived with the warden, a woman named Nina Kinsella, who actually came from Massachusetts. She had come up in her criminal justice career through the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. It's not clear to me that the Kennedys knew her. I don't think that they did. But again, through all her connections, she was able to get access to a federal prison that most researchers wouldn't get access to. And she spent a lot of time there. And she helped orient the women to prison. She interviewed them all. She took terrific notes about her observations. And she had lots of problems with the prison system and lots of ideas about how to correct it. She never did write this piece that she went in there intending to write, and I'm not certain why. I think she might have been preempted because a reporter from the Chicago newspaper had gotten into Alderson as well and wrote a piece that covered, I think, a lot of the material that Eunice might have considered writing.
That's still pretty incredible. Just that thought, I think that it would be I know that there are people that visit prisons all the time, but the idea of living in one is...
And living with people, and they weren't all in for nonviolent crimes.
Right.
I mean, there were people
some dangerous people there.
There were some dangerous people, kidnappers, gangsters, malls, people who were in for treason.
So later she moved to Chicago. She did social work. So maybe talk a little bit about what Chicago was like in the 50s and what Eunice did there.
So she worked with the nuns, with the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. She was the liaison between this reformatory they ran for what we then called wayward girls. Wayward girl could mean that you ran away from home because your father was abusing you. We don't know what that term meant. It was a catch-all. So these girls were alone in the world, and Eunice would visit the juvenile court. The first juvenile court in the country was founded in Chicago in 1899. And so they had a pretty sophisticated system there. And she was the liaison between the courts and this House of the Good Shepherd, where these girls would serve out their sentences. She did remarkable things there. She revamped programming. She brought in people from the community to come in and teach these girls that they could have a life outside of crime.
It was like some celebrities, right, that she was able to bring.
She did. She brought in Congressman, her mother, Rose Kennedy, came to talk about what it was like to be the wife of the ambassador to Great Britain. She brought in reporters for the Chicago newspapers who helped them learn how to write. She started a little newspaper for the reformatory that hadn't existed before. She even brought in people from Elizabeth Arden to teach them how to walk properly, how to use silverware properly, how to speak properly. She was trying to give them a view of the world that was broader than the one they'd had.
And so she did a lot of these little projects, where, I don't want to say a little, but she did a lot of these projects where she was working with people kind of very hands-on.
Yes.
Whether prison or in Chicago. And you mentioned earlier the Kennedy Foundation. So talk a little bit about how she hijacked that and what she directed it towards and how she kind of had, greater ambitions for it.
So the Kennedy Foundation was founded after Joe Kennedy Jr. was killed in World War II. And his father wanted some kind of living memorial to his son, his oldest son. And so in the first 10 years of its existence, it gave grants that were sort of random. They built a skating rink in Hyannis. They paid for an altar at their local church on Cape Cod. They paid for construction of schools for children with what we then called mental retardation. But when Eunice took over the foundation in the mid to late 50s, she turned its emphasis to research, to finding universities that would do serious research about intellectual disabilities, because none of it was being done. None of it was financed by the federal government. So this small little family foundation was giving millions of dollars to places like the University of Wisconsin, Stanford, Mass General Hospital, to start doing genetic research, psychological research, all kinds of research that simply hadn't been done before. She kind of created the field.
Yeah, I thought that was especially incredible that first off, that it hadn't been done. I really, until I had read through the book, and I didn't really know the depths of, the kind of horrors of the way that people were treated.
People with intellectual disabilities in the 50s, they were confined to these Dickensian institutions, or they were hidden away at home. And they were hidden away because there was no public programming for them. And just to show the influence that she had, even in her own family, Jack Kennedy was on the Senate committee that was supposed to hear testimony about the need for special education teachers. We didn't have special education teachers in the late 50s. So the first piece of legislation that would put federal money into education for these kids came before the senator's committee, and he didn't stick around that day to listen to the testimony. And it's ironic, because the advocates for these children knew what the rest of the country as yet did not, which is this issue had touched the Kennedy family as well. It took Eunice to get Jack to turn his attention to this issue. And it's no small thing that the Kennedy Foundation, for its entire existence, has had as its president either John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, or Ted Kennedy. And never a single day of that existence of that foundation were those men involved in the running of it. She ran it, and they got the credit for it.
Yeah, that's a crazy situation. I think that would drive me nuts. Did she try and get that changed, or did she realize that wasn't important enough? That wasn't the fight she should be fighting?
I think it was important to her. I think she was not without ego. I think she would have liked to have been listed on the letterhead. But so she wasn't the president. She was the one who had the power. She decided where the money went. And if there was one thing about Eunice that struck me, it's that she was always pragmatic. What is it? What's your goal? What's your aim? How do you get there? And she pushed things out of the way that just weren't as important.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of putting it. What are some of the things you think that weren't as important that she pushed out of the way that maybe other people wouldn't have?
Well, she wasn't, she wasn't a Washington hostess. She was, when her kids describe her, they described, this disheveled clothes and the men's trousers and men's pants and never combing her hair. She carried her pencils in her hair. She had wonderful, beautiful, thick hair. And she was really indifferent to all those kind of superficialities that were pretty important in her social set.
And that's especially interesting also because you were just mentioning how in Chicago she was hiring people to help teach those women, the wayward girls, those skills as well. She
they needed
recognized
those
them.
skills. She knew they needed those skills. She didn't need
Yeah.
those skills. She had her father's money,
Yeah. Yeah.
and she was going to use it for things that mattered to her.
Right.
Right.
So, yeah, speaking of things that matter to her, so it's interesting you said at the beginning that most people might be familiar with her in terms of her connection to the Special Olympics, which I actually didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
So this was news to me, and I thought absolutely fascinating. So maybe talk a little bit about how the Special Olympics came to be, Eunice's part and all that.
So her influence begins really in earnest, I think, when Jack Kennedy becomes the president of the United States. Even before he took the oath of office, she convinced him that he needed to put the issue of intellectual disabilities on the national agenda. As I said before, Jack had no record of caring about this issue, but she cared about it. And when Eunice cared about something, Jack Kennedy knew that she had done the research and that whatever she recommended would likely be the most pragmatic course to follow. So before he took the oath, he committed to her that he would create a president's panel on mental retardation and staff it with researchers and judges and psychologists and parents and teachers to figure out what was the need in that population, how could the federal government help, and then draft legislation to get it done. And she did that within 2 years. And when you go to the Kennedy Library and you read the oral histories of the people that were on that panel, to a person, they attribute the success of that panel to Eunice Kennedy Shriver. She was mostly concerned at that time with their physical health, with research into the causes of mental retardation, and education. But in 1962, she started a camp in her backyard that she called Camp Shriver. And how that camp came about says everything about Eunice. A mother called her and said, the Kennedy administration is spending so much effort on this issue. Why is there no place for me to send my child to summer camp? So Eunice looked out the backyard. Her backyard consisted of 200 acres and horses and a swimming pool and a basketball court. And she started Camp Shriver. And she took kids from institutions, she took kids from private homes, and she hired high school kids from the local Catholic schools, and she bussed in juvenile delinquents who were serving time at the Lorton Reformatory, some of them for violent crimes, to come in on a prison bus and work with these children all day and then go back to the institution at night. I mean, that's inconceivable that anyone would do that today. But she believed in second chances for those prisoners as well as for these kids.
Yeah. So, but I want to think bigger. How did that actually go? How did the Special Olympics themselves come about? Because I thought that I thought there was a little bit of controversy about the way in which sort of the Special Olympics, by title, were created and Eunice's credit for it or not.
Right. So, and the model for it, as I say, is what happened in her backyard. But all around the country, she was funding through the Kennedy Foundation, municipalities, little small towns to create similar camps to the one in her backyard. One of the places the Kennedy Foundation funded was the Chicago Park District. And in the Chicago Park District, there was a wonderful young woman named Anne McGlone Burke. And Anne was 23 years old. She started like a play group and an athletic group for children with mental retardation. She wanted to go bigger, better. She wanted to have a citywide track meet for these kids. And did the Kennedy Foundation think that was possible? So she wrote up a big proposal that she called it the National Olympics for the Retarded. And she sent that proposal into Eunice. And Eunice gave the Chicago Park District $25,000 in 1968 to sponsor what became the first Special Olympics. She then did what the Kennedys are often prone to do. She saw a good idea and she stole it. She went out for those Olympic Games in Chicago and announced, unbeknownst to the Chicago Park District, that she was going to take it national, that they were going to build on what they were doing there that weekend in July in 1968, and they were going to replicate it all across the country. And of course, now it's been replicated all across the world. And Ann Burke, who now is a justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, will tell you that she resented that she sort of stole her idea on the one hand, but on the other hand, who else but someone like Eunice Kennedy Shriver could take a good idea and enlarge it on an international scale, as she's done.
You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet? Something like that?
Something like that. And she's not the first Kennedy to do it. Jack Kennedy gets credit for the Peace Corps, but it was Hubert H. Humphrey's idea. He proposed legislation in the 50s creating the Peace Corps. And Jack picked up the idea during the 1960 primary campaign. And in our cultural imagination, it's Jack Kennedy's idea, but in historical fact, it's Humphrey's.
So one thing that I thought was very interesting is we've talked a lot about how Eunice was way ahead of her time for many issues, juvenile delinquency, mental health issues, that sort of thing. But it seems like the part about abortion and teen pregnancy sort of indicated that it seems like she was coming from a different direction, maybe a more religious perspective. You're shaking your head. You disagree. Because it seemed like she was a bit conservative about whether people should be having abortions and teenage pregnancy and how to solve those problems.
Well, we're having this conversation in 2018.
Yeah.
After Roe v. Wade has been on the books for a very long time, since 1973. Eunice Kennedy came to the abortion issue in the 60s, before Roe. And in the 60s, abortion was the anti-abortion position was a liberal position.
Oh, interesting.
I think we don't know the history before Roe. And the history before Roe is that a lot of progressives saw the government's encouragement of birth control and abortion among those on welfare as cultural genocide. The Black Panther Party had an anti-abortion plank for just that reason. They thought that it was a device by the government to reduce the number of black people in the country. People who were anti-poverty activists and workers, many of them Jesuits, Catholic priests, opposed abortion for the same reason. They thought it was treating poor people differently.
So I didn't know that at all. So that's very interesting to me. I have no idea how much you know about this, but I'm maybe curious enough to ask one follow-up, which is how did that shift happen? I mean, besides Roe v. Wade, I mean, how that's a huge change to have people.
Well, it shifted in the mid to late 60s. In fact, before Bobby Kennedy's death, he had endorsed the liberalization of the New York State abortion law, which prohibited all abortions except in the case of the life of the mother. And he endorsed a more liberalized version of that law. And that was happening state by state all across the country. But curiously enough, it was Republicans who were pushing to legalize abortion. Abortion had been illegal in the country since the 1900s, early 1900s. In the 1800s even, these anti-abortion laws had gone on the books. And they were being overturned state by state. Ronald Reagan in 1967 signed one of the first state laws that made abortion accessible to people under broader conditions than it had been available before. It wasn't until after Roe that the political parties switched their positions on Roe. Ted Kennedy was in the United States Senate, opposed abortion after Roe. Because the Democratic Party becomes a party of abortion rights, so does Ted Kennedy. Eunice Kennedy Shriver never changed her position on abortion. She chose, rather than to carry placards in the street, to spend her time working on legislation that would funnel more money to pregnant teenagers, to education, rather than to hope that you could overturn Roe, something that she didn't think was realistic. And again, she was a pragmatist. If we can't eliminate abortion, we can reduce the numbers.
Fair enough. She went about it her own way. sort of the theme of the book,
Kind of.
perhaps. All right, so I like to always ask, we've gone through a lot here. Is there anything else that you think people should know, or anything else anything you'd really like people to take away from the book?
Well, I would like people to be surprised, and I suspect they will be surprised when they see the breadth of what Eunice Kennedy Shriver did in her life. And then I'd like people to ask themselves, why is it so easy to write women out of history? Why, she's been dead since 2009. Why has it taken so long for us to recognize the contributions of this extraordinary, difficult, but extraordinary woman?
I like that. So this is maybe a silly question at this point, but I like to ask, what's next? What else are you working on? After 7 years, it may just be vacation, but I'm curious.
Vacation starts tomorrow.
Vacation.
Actually.
Oh,
It starts tomorrow.
hooray!
Yes. Hooray.
Okay, well, good. You get a nice break because
Thanks.
this book is, like I mentioned at the beginning, this book is exhaustively researched, and it shows just quite a commitment on your part. So that's pretty amazing. All right, so I like to wrap up with just a couple fun questions, and
Okay.
then we'll call it a day. So, what is your favorite food and or drink?
Well, I'm a New Englander, so I guess a lobster roll.
Okay,
Right. That
Done.
Seems to me feel.
and where is your favorite place you've ever been?
A little basin up in a lake in upcountry New Hampshire. The name of which I won't tell you because then you'll go there
And
and
I'll
ruin
go.
it.
Okay, all right.
Where I can hang out with the loons.
And finally, if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Oh, that's a great question. There's so many things. I'd instate serious campaign finance reform laws in this country. I would publicly finance our campaigns so that we could get money out of politics.
All right, here. All right, well, that wraps it up. The book is Eunice, the Kennedy Who Changed the World. The author, Eileen McNamara. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, John.
This book is just so great. I've said it many times, but it really is. It's a biography that will keep you turning the page, and I heartily recommend it. Thanks so much for joining me. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.